Okay, so good morning, everyone. I see they have this room arranged well, so you're not looking out the window at the beautiful day and feel tempted to get outside. So from my introduction, I'd like to add a little more because you're probably wondering why this development person is up here talking about security in Africa. So a little bit more about my background. I actually am now up to about 30 years. That's a little bit of an old bio, I think, working in the African continent, and much of my work was actually in post-conflict countries, and in several of them I worked on programs relating to disarmament, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. And that was for about 8 or 9 years. After that, for the last 10 years, I've been working on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism programs. So while my formal training is not in the security sector, my work has actually for a long time been focused on countries dealing with security issues. And most recently, in the last about 15 months, I participated in 3 what we call risk assessments of violent extremism. One was in Uganda, one was in Tanzania, and one was in Kenya. So I think I have a fairly reasonable reference point to discuss some of the topics today. So the first thing was really discussing what is the nature of the threat in the Horn of Africa. And having done, when we look at the threat, the first thing is to look at the nature of the source of the threat. And in the Horn of Africa, over the last 10 years, it really hasn't changed. The main driver has been Somalia. So before it was Al-Shabaab, but basically that's what we would call the engine. A lot of the terrorist threats spin from that engine. You know, there are other groups that have been labeled terrorist in the region. Most notably, there is ADF in Uganda and LRA. And while they are important in those countries, they tend to be more of an insurgency model, and they're really more of a localized threat. So when we're looking at the threat from a terrorist group, we sort of consider 3 effects. At least that's the way we sort of look at it when we're looking at violent extremism. The first thing is recruitment. The second thing is resourcing. How are they financing themselves? And the last thing are the attacks themselves. And so when you're analyzing recruitment, the main areas of recruitment have been and remain in Somalia itself and in Kenya. The other countries, while there has been concerns at different times that this would spread and there would be recruitment in other countries, the numbers are very, very low. Tanzania, where I was there in May of this year, the numbers are maybe tens, maybe up to the hundreds, but it's really mostly a handful. And why do we care about recruitment? Well, there's a couple of reasons that you're concerned about that. One is that it can also be an indication of more general support. If they're able to recruit in a country, then there is possibly other support, whether it's economic or otherwise, facilitation. The other thing is also, it's obviously if recruits come back. And you've heard much about foreign terrorist fighters, that issue, which it's very big in the news in the last 2 years about ISIL, but as many of my contacts when I've been in Kenya particularly, they say we've been dealing with foreign terrorist fighters for a long time, people coming back. So why are other countries not looking to us for some examples of how you can deal with that issue? So that's one of the other thing you look at is the resources. How are the terrorist groups funding themselves? And again, I'm talking predominantly about Al-Shabaab. In some parts of Africa, there's kidnapping for ransom. The Sahel is most notable for that, and that's been a very important resource. But by most accounts, what they know about Al-Shabaab, it's really, how will I put it, it's more conventional extortion. So it's making people in Somalia pay taxes so for security. It was the important control of the charcoal industry. and also basically black market with sugar. So these are, sort of routine. There has been some wildlife trafficking, but it's basically sort of been business operations to a certain extent. And one of the interesting things about that is because it's sort of ordinary, it actually has a fairly high, I think, chance to be a corrupting influence on local governments, on the way people perceive taxation and other systems. So it's actually a little bit more insidious. And then sort of the last part looking at it is the potential of the attacks. And if you look at it, and there's lots of different ways that they track attacks in a region, again, Somalia and Kenya by far have had the greatest number of attacks. Uganda has had some, and Tanzania has also had a few, but it's the scale, the number of incidences is much, much lower. And one of the reasons you look at that, again, to understand the problem and the nature of the threat is because what is terrorism? Terrorism is supposed to be an action that creates an outside effect, usually beyond the actual victims and oftentimes beyond the actual place that the attack happened. And so looking at what is the threat, really the focus is on Somalia and Kenya. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about why Kenya has been such a target. And why do you have to try to sort of break apart and understand what the threat is? Because that helps you understand what your response is going to be. And so in all of the incidences, all the countries, the response is really initially a security-led response. If it's a place where it's basically insurgency, it's obviously going to be a military response. When it's a lower level of attacks or scale of incidents or frequency, it might be the police, civilian security, but it's still a security-led response. The only time you might get into something where you have although we talk about an integrated and a holistic approach, you can't really have much effect with development assistance until there's a level of I think, stability, because development is more on the side of prevention. And security often is interdiction, trying to get at sort of calming the threat initially. I think the other thing is looking at is what is the level of the security in the region at this moment. From my assessments when I was out there, the reality is that in Uganda and Tanzania, which is probably the next tier down of attacks and instability related to terrorism, the response is being led by the police for the most part. And one would argue that they're actually up to the task. And in part, it's because of the nature of the threat. In Uganda, the police are, security services, intelligence as well, are basically monitoring ethnic Somalis, I will put it that way. And they're able to track them pretty well. So the scale of attacks, the security services seem up to the scale of the attacks. In Tanzania, it's sort of a blend of community policing, monitoring, a little bit of a response, depending on the level of incidences. And again, it seems that the security services are up to the level of attempted incidences. They're usually very modest. So overall, one would argue that the Horn is somewhat in a status quo, because in each country, the security services seem to be able to keep up with the level of attacks. I would say that it doesn't look like there's significant reduction, and maybe that'll take a little more time, a little bit more of an adjustment, but that's what it looks like right now from my perspective of threat. I think one of the other things in looking at how, going into sort of the next theme about how you come up with a strategy in a country, as I said, CVE first and foremost, or the response, is security-led, because it's based first upon understanding the nature of the threat. And, often it's police, when they talk about a whole-of-government approach, the parts of the government that are involved are the police, intelligence, security, but often we want to go beyond to the community leaders, religious leaders, and other government agencies. And right now in the Horn, several countries are at different stages. And I think the examples, again, sometimes correspond to both what tools are available, but also the natures of the threat. So in Somalia, they have approved a national counterterrorism strategy. It was a participatory process. I think it's been approved by the government. I don't think it's been implemented in any way, but they have a nice plan. In Kenya, they have had several years of quite visible meetings and events and processes to come up with their plan. I don't think to date it's been released. No? So, but I think it's being implemented to a certain extent because it's part of the process has been, I guess they're just not waiting for it to a certain extent. So the community is involved in developing responses. There are attempts for integrated approach in certain areas with the police. So having a visible process has allowed a certain amount of implementation. But I think overall, and our own country in itself, has been challenged with implementing an integrated plan. And I think part of the problem has been that some of the key areas of where, how people join or support groups are very different. And there's been a lot of discussion about, can we understand what makes a person want to join a group? What makes a person want to actually use violence for ideological extremism, to support extremist groups? And if any of you have read anything, they come back and keep saying it's inconclusive, it depends, it's very individualistic. But I think you can come up with sort of three main areas that kind of seem to be common for people. One is what's called the search for identity. I mean, and it's broken down in different ways. People want to belong to something. Young people want to be part of a cause, or they want to feel important, or they want to just get something, some resources, some money. The other main area is, frankly, a sense of injustice, revenge, retribution, a response to the fact that something has happened and that the legal framework, the legal system in a country is basically allows for impunity for a certain group, or your group is differentially a victim of it. And so that tends to be a fairly common one and often something that pushes someone over the edge. And then the last one is truly ideological conversion or beliefs, that it's really about, one would say religion, it could be in some instances, I guess, a political ideology, but it's based on ideology. And so I think one of the challenges that we're facing is we're using a blend of tools to go after all of them, even though the sources are very different. If you're thinking about the issue of identity and belonging and having standing in your community, I don't think the security services are probably the best suited to deal with that. That one probably should go more towards the whole host of government line ministries and community resources, whether it's trauma counseling, whether it's education, whether it's curriculum reform. On the other hand, the idea of injustice, about the effects of the security services or the legal system on you or your family or your community, you know, some of those instances, it's going to be very hard for a community group to really address that directly. And that seems to go more where that should be a security-led one. And then the last one about religious, it's sort of cross-cutting, but there's a very notable effects of interfaith groups addressing some of those ideological issues and giving tools to people in the community. And so I think, you know, going forward, once you come up with an integrated plan, a holistic plan, a whole of government plan, it may be wise to start to differentiate a little about what is the primary effect that you're trying to have, and to come up with more of a division of labor. Because right now, and I will say even within the U.S. government, my experience is we're having everyone trying to do a little bit of everything, and that may not be the best way. I think you need to start playing to your strengths. I think one of the other things to pay attention to is perhaps the idea of how do you where is the overlap, or is there something about sequencing of efforts? So if you're working on access to justice and rule of law, and then after that, do you start dealing with issues of identity, or do you do it concurrently, and how does that work? But I think that that's one of the other ones. The last one is the cross-cutting theme about response would be the issue of youth. And I think one of the areas that I've seen that's been a gap is the area of universities. Again, I've done most of my career has been in sub-Saharan Africa, and I can't tell you from across the Sahel, everywhere from Mauritania all the way back to Kenya, I would hear, well, there's a group in the university, there's university recruitment, they're the leaders, or there's something going on. And I don't think we have very many tools to work in that area. I think many countries are a little bit nervous about university students because there's a history of activism and année blanche in Francophone countries and things like that. But I think they also could be part of the solution, being leaders, being models, and I don't think we've tapped into that as both understanding whether it's a problem, but also as a resource. So the last one I'm going to shift to a little bit in my discussion was a question of why Kenya? Why is Kenya seem to be affected more by al-Shabaab than one would think, or terrorism than one would think? And so again, going back to trying to look at what is the nature of the threat, one is sort of and why Kenya? One is sort of obvious. There's a bit of geography. I mean, the shared border, the shared movement of people, the border that divided groups that are on both sides. I mean, so that's an obvious point. But there's other countries that share a border with Somalia, Ethiopia, that also you would think would be affected and has some of the same issues about a border dividing groups, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So I think the second one is maybe the internal response. Again, I've been working on this, and I'm going to Kenya and did my first risk assessment in Kenya back in 2009. And there has been a clear evolution in how the country and the government perceived the terrorist threat. Initially, for many, many years, I think all the way up until probably 2012, 13, it was seen as basically terrorist incidents happened to occur in Kenya because they were going after outsiders who lived in Kenya. They were going after the Americans, they were going back the Israelis, but it really had nothing to do with Kenya. It was just an accident of geography and that they have such a large expat population. That shifted other countries. Ethiopia has been extremely vigilant about any instability, and so I don't think they ever took it very lightly. So I think that's one of the main reasons. I think the other thing is going back to terrorism having an outside effect beyond the actual incident. And whether this has been proven, but it's been discussed, is that the idea is Kenya part of basically the battlefield? And if so, then destabilizing Kenya would be very important. And so there's been, I think many analysts have thought that one of the ideas is to create a Christian-Muslim divide and frankly a Christian-Muslim war in Kenya. And certainly the Kenyans seem to believe that because they have been extremely sensitive and very responsive, both within the Muslim community, the Christian community, civil society, the government itself. They've made a concerted effort, mostly civil society, to make sure that they're very visibly and vocally saying this isn't all Muslims, this isn't against Christians. And when I was there a few months ago, they highlighted the incident where they tried to separate Christians and Muslims out, and the Muslims refused to identify. Okay, I'm going to sign. So I think I guess the last thing is just that so the other countries, and there's been talking about the Amazon troop contributors. And when I was in Tanzania, there was some comment about, Tanzania, part of why Tanzania really hasn't seen the escalation that might have been planned is because they don't have troops. But again, I would argue that while there was the incidents in 2010 in Uganda that seem to be linked to their troop presence. We want to argue Ethiopia's had troops in Somalia from the beginning, and that doesn't seem to be a trigger. Burundi, there was threats, but it really didn't seem to be a trigger. So I think the stronger argument, honestly, for Kenya is the ones that I made out, that its geography was about taking that making it part of the battlefield, destabilizing Kenya overall, and not really about the number of troops or their contribution to Amazon. And I think with that, I will end there.